And that's what he's essentially saying, is saying, hey, you'll always have your structure and there's things that you need to do in order to present yourself well in front of him. And yet you're going to miss the moment because you've spent all your time creating the structure. And so that's the balance between the two, saying, yes, we need structure for life and we won't make progress without structure. But what value is that progress if we don't pay attention to transformational moments? And I want to use that term transformational moments because there's all sorts of moments we can have. But the ones that we remember, the ones that we capture, the ones that change us are those transformational moments.
Hello and welcome back to ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I am Art Calderon. I'm here with Reed Nyffeler, a CEO of a growing global company, father and husband. He's going to share some wisdom and experience with us on all these subjects. A brief recap. Reed, when I say brief, it's brief because we've been around a while. Priorities is what we started with. The next section was habits. Know your purpose, start your journey, be present on purpose. That's where we're currently at, being present on purpose. And episode 24 episodes, that's 24 weeks, attentional moments. That's right. I said attentional moments, and I think we're going to expound on that a little bit. Review, first of all, before we get into that, review for us what it means to be present and why it's important to fulfilling your purpose.
Yeah, I think a lot of us fill our time with our calendars, right? I mean, everything's there and we're not there, but we're not present, right? I mean, so what does not present look like? I think we can see that obviously. Somebody on their phone not looking. You know, one of the things my wife always said, look him in the eye, right? Always look him in the eye, stare him in the eye, because then we're actively listening. And, you know, when I was in 7th and 8th grade, I remember distinctly making a conscious decision to be present. And I said, if I am present and I hyper-focus on what the teacher is saying and what is here, it just saves so much time, right? Because I listened to what she was saying. She said, this will be on the test. I thought, I should probably listen to that because it'll be on the test. Versus someone's like, oh, I was talking to my friend or I'm writing notes or whatever the case might be. And so I really focused as a lifelong habit at that stage of listening intently and being present.
You were in junior high.
7th and 8th grade.
12 years old.
Correct.
And how did you have the presence of mind or the self-awareness? What was it? Because most kids at that age cannot even verbalize that, but you were able to see that was important and you needed to start even at that young age.
So I saw the cost of not being present, right? And I think that's where I said, I need to make a change. I said, if I'm not paying attention, not present, I'd miss some material information. And if I wasn't present, I wasn't making progress. And so I said, okay, the not being present has a cost, right? It costs us relationships, right? If we look back at all the things we've lost, it's never because we were present. It's because we're recovering for times we weren't present. We didn't pay attention in school. We weren't present, right? We weren't at home and our home life may deteriorate, right? We weren't at work or present mentally and emotionally at work in our full self. And so I looked back and I said, there's a lot more cost. And certainly, I don't make progress by not being present. So there's a tremendous amount of progress and value by being present. So it is my inclination, my intention to be present, and I'm going to do that on purpose. I'm going to make that decision that regardless of how boring things could be, right? Because I remember telling my mom as I was growing up, I'm bored. And ultimately, the difference of bored means someone has to entertain me. And I think the society is saying, I'm being bored. Instead of saying, wait a minute, what could I be focused on that would keep my attention? And that's where I learned to be present. And so my nephew was going to college, and the first semester he was there, he said, man, this is a complete and utter waste of time. Now, I didn't disagree because I think, and this is a whole nother conversation, but I think that education has, declined to the level of I guess our interests, I suppose. And ultimately we've degraded or watered down our education. And I said, well, it's your job in every environment to find something you can learn. Is what I said to him. I said,
instead of just putting it off on somebody else.
Just say, right, the curriculum's not good for you. The teachers are a problem, whatever the case might be. We can find any reason that we can be bored and not present. Instead, we should focus on what we can be present to do.
That goes back to you saying helping people overcome their self-imposed barriers.
Correct.
Right? You're not going to change the education system.
Nope.
But you can change right here.
So I told him, I said, listen to how the teacher says something. And listen on both sides, saying, why is it irrelevant that bores you? How could it be said? If you could think in your mind, what could be relevant information that's relevant for the teacher to teach on this subject matter? And how could it be communicated in a way that gauged the attention? Going back to what we said on the last podcast, which was focus on what is drawing the audience, right? We love transference of energy. So if we see that energy transferred, how can that be retransferred? And then apply that in your life. That's something you can take by being present in the moment. We can always learn something from everyone. And that could be what not to do, of course. That be what we could do. And as I tell a lot of people is, what would you do were you in that role? Should you ever aspire to be in that role? And that's, again, being present and finding something that keeps our interest in that same period of time. And so then we're going to do it on purpose. Everywhere I'm at, I'm saying, what can I learn from this environment, right? If I go to another restaurant that's a franchise, I'm saying, what can I learn from this environment, right? What can I learn to or not to do? And then I try to look at managerial theory. I listen to what the manager is saying to their subordinates.
When you travel?
When I travel, of course, I'm listening to conversations and having conversations with the people I'm sitting next to on the plane. And those are all things I'm learning from, and I'm being present on purpose instead of ignoring everyone until they engage me, which is the way most people live life, or not being present and suffering the consequences, which is what led me to being present.
Yeah. All right. Now, let's go back to this word attentional. Attentional, right? I think we have just welcomed in a brand new word to the English language. You've heard it here first, folks. Attentional. Define that for us. What does that mean to you? What does that word mean?
First of all, I love the word attentional for many, many, many reasons. The first one is we always stop when we hear a word that we haven't heard before, and it gives us pause. And so for me, that's a trigger to remember to be present on purpose, because we can't, if we hear words all the time and they're very consistent in our vernacular, we don't stop. We don't even remember saying it because it's so frequent. Attentional is a word that is like, did he say intentional?
Which you didn't.
Which I did not.
No.
Or did he say attention? Did he mean to say that? Did he mispronounce it? And in either way, you've paused on that word longer than you otherwise would have.
It's a hook.
It's a hook. And it's really two things to remind me, which is pay attention and be intentional. And so if I'm paying attention, right, that means I'm present. And if I'm being intentional, I'm using that information I'm gathering by paying attention.
You're not just
to be
sitting
intentional.
there.
I'm not passive.
You're not just passively paying attention, but you're also being intentional.
Right.
With the application.
And it's probably a one-word summary of my purpose statement, right?
Okay.
So it is ultimately a one-word summary of my purpose statement, because I cannot accomplish my purpose statement without being intentional.
Share with us a moment, a pivotal moment in your life where you were attentional and that made a shift. Now, you talked about being a kid, 12 years old in school, but surely there's been many since then that have had an impact on your career or your family or your outlook on life. Share one or two of those moments with us.
Yeah. So first of all, I think when we look at the moment section of this podcast compared to everything else that we're talking about when we're operationalizing our habits, essentially, many of those are measures of time, right? From a month to a week to a day. They're very consistent and universal measurements of time. But as a moment, if we say, just give me a moment, nobody knows exactly how long that is. And we don't know when it's going to, we can't calendar a moment. We can't say on this arbitrary date at this particular time, I'm going to have a moment, right? They just happen to us, right? If someone says I'm having a moment, we know what they mean. That means, okay, they need a break. It wasn't scheduled or articulated in their time, and it's a moment. And so that's critical to understand, because everything else before has been structural. This is intuitional. So in our intuition, we want to have a moment. And why do I do that? Because we can live our lives. And if you talk to somebody that's so structural, they cannot attention. And my wife says to me, stop and smell the flowers. I'm like, I have to get from point A to point B. And I did not account for the structural time to smell the flowers.
Yeah. Because smell them later.
It just didn't put it in my calendar. Put it in my calendar and I'll be there, right? Ultimately, but that is saying that, hey, the schedule matters more than the person, right? It's essentially saying you will always have your schedule, but here is your moment. And I think as we look at things with regard to our faith, right? There was a story in there that, Martha and Mary were there and hosting Jesus. And he said, you'll always have this, but you won't have me. That's the moment. They missed the moment that they had in that moment with him. And that's what he's essentially saying, is saying, hey, you'll always have your structure, and there's things that you need to do in order to present yourself well in front of him. And yet you're going to miss the moment because you've spent all your time creating this structure. And so that's the balance between the two, is saying, yes, we need structure for life, and we won't make progress without structure. But what value is that progress if we don't pay attention to transformational moments? And I want to use that term, transformational moments, because there's all sorts of moments we can have. But the ones that we remember, the ones that we capture, the ones that change us are those transformational moments. And so that is really what we want to pay attention to is this a transformational moment? And so I'll give a story about that. And I remember sitting in my office, and I have a dear friend, and I was sitting there, and I believe I was actually having a meeting with you at the time, Art. And then I was informed that this dear friend had his family was in an accident,
Mm-hmm.
and they came in and said, this dear friend was notified that by a chaplain that he needs to come to the hospital immediately. And at that time, I remember being there with you specifically, and we stopped and we prayed. Unfortunately, two of his children, their children passed away. At the time, I was leading a youth program, and so this particular friend's children were in the youth program, and they attended. And so then many of the kids that were in that group came with me to the memorial. And while at the memorial, I remember saying, "Okay, this is a time where they probably have never had a peer that has passed away." I went to this dear friend, and he said, "I just wish this wasn't in vain." And I remember specifically saying, "You won't be able to count the lives affected by this event." And I saw these students here, and I said, "They're not going to forget this moment." So I wanted to pray. And so I prayed with them. And then, unbeknownst to me, there was a photographer that took a picture of that. And the spouse of my friend has that up on her feed that comes every time around the memorial. And so 4 years later, she asked me, and she said, "Reed, I just wanted to ask you, now that it was years later, what was this all about and what was going on?" And sure enough, I look in that photo, and sure enough, standing next to me, praying with them, was the older brother of the one of the best friends. When I didn't have the photo, I'd never seen it before. And I saw the faces of the people, and I put the piece of the puzzle together, and ultimately see that it manifests itself years later. You don't realize necessarily it's going to be a transformational moment, but we certainly won't be if we don't take that opportunity at that time. And so that's an example of being present for a transformational moment that'll be forever remembered.
I think that some people at first glance to this podcast would think, "Oh, this is about business and how to be how to run a better business, make more money, be more influential, rise in the ranks, be more powerful, and everything." But you just shared a story that was about relationship and about people, and about the importance of setting aside what seems important and what seems to be the highest priority when something comes in that is more important and has an effect on other people. Um, Talk a little bit about the importance of noticing everybody in the room, of noticing people, maybe even people that are marginalized that other people wouldn't notice. How can you balance the fact that you're running this multi-million-dollar company, and because of your faith, number one priority, that one of your jobs is to notice that person? How do you balance that?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think so many people think they're committed to their purpose, but they're committed to their perception. Meaning that we live our entire lives to build up this perception of everybody else that we're fulfilling our purpose, when ultimately we've lost our purpose as a result. We want people to think highly of us. We want people to think that we have it all made. We want people to think externally that everything's going well. And that becomes our purpose, and it replaced our ultimate purpose that we're defined. And so I am supremely committed to my purpose as a result, and I don't care about my perception. And that is what leads me to always go back to my purpose, because if I'm worried about my perception, what will others think? What will others think if I
That's
do?
paralyzing.
That's right. And so ultimately we build this perception, and we get lost in that. And then we get to the latter stages of our life. We're like, what was I doing? Right? What was I doing this entire time? And so again, my purpose is about other people. Right. And so I think the noticing thing is critical here, because so many times we think our schedule is transformational, not the moments.
Mm-hmm.
So many people, and I always say this, everyone works on the wedding, not on the marriage, right? And does the wedding actually transform us? So you're saying one little signature on a page that's a document issued by the ordained and or the state, or depending on where we're at, changes our life. It's transformational because we signed the document. Now, one could argue maybe for tax purposes, it transformed our income status.
Not to mention the money you spent on the wedding.
That's okay. But is that transformational?
Right.
Or is the love that is present in that marriage transformational? And so that's where many would say August 1st, 1998, that's when I got married. My life changed. I would argue that it didn't change that day. It was just confirmed that day.
Right.
Because ultimately it was changed the day that I met Dana, right? Because I recognized this is the person that will be my wife. Now,
you started that commitment before that day.
100%, right? And ultimately I'm just confirming that in front of man and God,
right?
Ultimately. But many people are hyper fixated on that wedding that, now it's irreversible. Well, if our lives and hearts did not change predating that, right? The transformational moment for me, at least, was not at the culmination of the, may now kiss the bride moment at the wedding. That was not transformational. That was confirmatory because the transformation happened earlier. And that's the difference between a moment that was transformational, which is when I knew that was going to be my wife, and the schedule that would say this was a transformational moment. And so many times, and I'll use another analogy that might apply to others. Were we transformed when we were handed that, degree from that university? Was that the moment? Or were we transformed when we acquired the knowledge and applied that to our careers? Where's the transformation? Because I see countless people that have that degree and it really is of no value than the paper it was printed on because their lives did not change. And as much as they want to, equate transformational to a degree or a letters beside their name, their transformation is really the application of knowledge because their lives transform. People pay for the transformation of that knowledge to activity in a business, not for the degree. Yet we in the world and in our lives value the degree or the paper or the marriage license or the birth certificate, right? And I'll use another example. Birth. These are all transformational moments, and it's just designed to help the audience think about this in their lives. Were we transformed at the day of that birth? And I would say yes. In this case, an instance and time are the two. This is the only thing I can think of where transformation happens is the birth of a child in a true sense. Because we can never, we know we committed to love, but that moment that they're there, your life is truly transformed, and it is an event in that case.
Oh, yeah.
Now, at the same time, we don't know the date and time. They say that only 5% of babies are born on their actual, scheduled birth date.
Those are horrible odds.
Those are horrible odds, but we're transformed in that moment.
Yeah.
And even though we can kind of, within a couple of weeks in most cases, determine when that moment's going to be, we really don't know. And many times, if you go back, the mother will always remember what predated the birth of the child, meaning the moments before and afterwards. Then right afterwards, you remember that and you share those pictures with everyone else. And we always talk about those transformational moments. And forever, as parents, our lives have been forever transformed, right? And we've just been living the life on the other side of that birth ever since for all 4 of our kids. And so that's a transformational moment that is in a schedule, that is a defined area that everybody knows about, that is truly transforms the lives of parents, in this case, going forward.
So with all these things that happen to you and around you, and that are again pulling for your attention, how do you stay refreshed, and how do you remember, okay, why I'm doing this is my purpose? What helps you make that connection?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to when I crafted my purpose statement and ultimately why the sections that I talked about in a previous podcast are so important and relevant. Because through intuitive interaction, that's how I know who I'm going to help next, right?
Intuitive interaction.
Through intuitive interaction, first step. Second step, propel leaders. So that's how I know whom I'm going to help, right? So I can have intuitive interaction and see that this person needs help. But if they're not a leader, is that the highest and most effective use of my time? So I'm going to propel leaders. Then what am I going to do when I do that? Over their self-imposed barriers. So if I can't help them get over that, I'm not at the greatest utilization of my time. Then this is the part you're asking about in the end, so they can live out their unique purpose. And so if I help them over their self-imposed barriers and just sit back and watch as a fan, then I'm not able to help the next person. So I get refreshed when I say, you know what? They're living out their unique purpose. That is just a moment in time where any circumstance is there and I send them on their merry way. And the next person I'm saying, okay, who can I help next?
And that motivates you. That kind of.
So if you look at that's a 4-stage process, right? And that ultimately leads to refreshment. One of the things that I recently learned that I was surprised at is that as much as we give credit to the trees as to creating oxygen on the earth, the ocean creates even more. And the ocean, if it were just a stagnant water, would never do it. It's a matter of the waves. The waves are refreshing. It recirculates and ultimately gives life. And that is what our purpose statement should do, right? It should refresh on its own to give life through intuitive interaction. How do I find that person? Then who am I targeting that to? Propelling leaders. Then ultimately, how am I doing that over their self-imposed barriers? Then ultimately, when does that get fully refreshed? And when do I get refreshed? When I can see them living out their unique purpose. And each and every time, that's the recycling of that refreshes me to then the next time live out my unique purpose.
So one more time, attentional is...
Yeah.
Give us definition.
Paying attention and being intentional. Clearly, you weren't paying attention, so we can work on this, Art. You pay attention to what I have, and you
Yes.
intentionally repeat it back to me, okay? We can practice
All right.
next
All
time.
right.
But you pay attention,
You pay attention.
and then you intentionally act upon that, what you found.
Intentionally apply it.
That's attentional.
That's attentional.
Right.
Well, we reached the end of another podcast, folks. Thanks very much for joining us. Share this podcast with your friends. Thank you to Reed for sharing with us his knowledge and his experience. Next time, we continue with our final series of episodes for season 1, focused on a legacy of purpose. Legacy. That's a big shift, isn't it?
That's a long term.
Okay, good. Until then, I'm Art Calderon. Be purposeful.
As our last word, you have opportunity to create transformational moments everywhere, every day. The challenge is, are we really paying attention to them? Do we walk down the street with our heads down? Do we hear news items and feel sorry for the individual but not intervene? Or do we recognize that this is a purposeful calling? And through paying attention and being intentional, I can be a transformational element in someone else's life for that moment. There are moments happening all over the place. Find a way to transform in that moment, and you will ultimately be transformed.